Hey, have you ever heard about the term Delaware Statutory Trust and you're wondering, should I set one of these entities up? Well, hey, my name's Clint Coons with Anderson Business Advisors, and in this video, we're going to talk about the Delaware Statutory Trust and its uses, and also how you can get totally screwed up by setting it up with someone who does not know what they're doing. All right, let's get started. All right, so here's the deal. Recently, I came across a new client who brought to me a Delaware statutory trust that someone recommended they create for their real estate investing. Now, if you watch my other videos, I do talk about Wyoming statutory trust, and I have mentioned Delaware statutory trust on occasion. Now, the thing is that if you're not familiar with this type of entity, there are some valid uses when you want to set up this structure. Namely, if you're looking to avoid paying a state franchise tax like in the state of California, or you're looking for anonymity because maybe you're setting up an entity in Oregon and an LLC has to disclose who the governing people are, but a statutory trust is exempt. You see, a statutory trust is akin to a business entity. So what you can do with a statutory trust is you can set one of these entities up. You can choose your state. It can be Delaware, it could be Wyoming. It just have to have a statute behind it. So it's treated similar to a limited liability company from an asset protection standpoint. So if I put a property into this DST and I have a tenant inside of there and something goes wrong, then the DST is the one that's going to be sued, and me down here as the beneficiary, I'm not going to be liable for that debt. Now, what's brought on the popularity, because if you're wondering, why don't you just use a limited liability company rather than a DST? Well, originally, these entities gained favor with syndicators because in order to move from, let's say I'm over here and I sold a piece of property and I want to engage in a 1031 exchange. Well, in order to do that, a syndicator typically will create a limited liability company, right? So they set up an LLC and they want you to invest your 1031 exchange proceeds into this LLC. Well, the problem is an LLC interest does not qualify as like-kind property. So what Delaware did is they created this trust, a Delaware statutory trust, and if it's set up in a specific manner, you can qualify this interest for 1031 exchange purposes. So it allows a syndicator to go out there, they put together their syndication, they're going to buy an apartment building. Rather than structuring it in a limited liability company, if they want to expand their pool of investors, they'll run it as a Delaware statutory trust, and they'll qualify it for tax purposes as a grantor trust, which allows this exchange treatment. So that's kind of the backstory on these trusts, how they came about. Now, once they were enacted, people started seeing other uses for them as well. So what I've seen out there is that individuals will tell people, hey, set up a statutory trust, you're going to save on the complexity versus using an LLC. You create this trust. If you do it right, you're going to have built-in anonymity, because what we'll do is we'll use a nominee trustee here. That person will then resign, and then you'll step in as the successor trustees. Big red flag. I'll tell you why here in just a minute. When I actually go through a trust document that is completely screwed up, and this client, if they followed through with this and used this as their asset protection plan, would be hurting if they're involved in a lawsuit. Now, back to the statutory trust. So what happens here then is with this type of trust, a DST, you're also allowed to create series out of it, similar to a series limited liability company. So this is what has attracted certain individuals that promote this tool to tell investors, hey, create these separate series over here that are all going to be owned by the parent. And then what you'll do is you'll own your real estate in the individual series. So that works if this type of trust arrangement and the series arrangement is recognized in the state where you want to own the property. And therein lies the problem. For example, if you set up a series limited liability company in Texas, which recognizes it, and you created some cells, and then you wanted to bring this into California and own property in the individual cells, well, that's not going to be recognized because California does not recognize a series limited liability company. And that's why this structure here doesn't work as well, and it's going to fail. So if you're trying to own property directly in a Wyoming or Delaware statutory trust with cells, not going to happen. So how do you get around that then? How are people doing this? Well, what they'll do then is the promoter will tell you, all right, create your Delaware Statutory Trust, create your series here, and then what you'll want to do is create a land trust to own the property and have the land trust owned by the separate series. And then each series, of course, is owned by the parent. That does work. In fact, we use this same type of strategy when I talk about series limited liability companies, especially for people who invest in Tennessee. Now, this is the framework for the Delaware Statutory Trust and why people will promote this. But there's a problem. A lot of people that are out there promoting this type of structure do not understand the structure itself. So here's an example of what I'm referring to. So this was a Delaware Statutory Trust that was sent in for me to take a look at to advise the client on whether or not the structure he'd created, and he'd set this trust up and put many properties into it, whether or not it would actually work. So he told me it was set up as a series. Just like I described to you, this trust was set up to hold separate properties through land trust. So I started looking at it, and I went down here, and I noticed right away, when I've turned to the first page, this issue right here at the very top, where it talks about revocable trust agreement. All right, so let me get into this right now. Now, when I showed you with the 1031 exchange that you could roll into a Delaware Statutory Trust and would qualify for 1031 exchange treatment, the reason why is there is an IRS ruling that states if a Delaware Statutory Trust is set up in a very specific way, it qualifies to be treated as a grantor trust for federal tax purposes, a revocable grantor trust. Now, this trust here purports to be that type of trust because the drafter of this trust does not understand what is required in order to be a grantor trust. In fact, I would advise you do not set up a Delaware Statutory Trust or any statutory trust to meet grantor trust requirements. And here's why. Because if this is a grantor trust for Delaware Statutory Trust purposes, if you want it to qualify, then it cannot purchase additional assets. It means once you funded it with one asset, you're done. It can't receive any additional money that can be transferred into it to meet grantor trust tax status. So if I put say I needed cash for CapEx on a particular property, I can't move money into the trust. Once you've got the trust set up, you cannot negotiate any loans or leases for that property. So, I mean, think about this. You've got tenants in the property. You can't negotiate any leases with those tenants. You can't sell property and reinvest the proceeds inside of this trust. And you have to distribute all the cash flow to the beneficiaries. All right, now that's not how we run our real estate when we set up limited liability companies. We like to do all of those things. But this trust right here states that it is a grantor trust, a revocable grantor trust under Delaware law. So here's the problem. If you're stating that this is a revocable trust under Delaware law, but you haven't set it up as such, then it may not be recognized as a statutory trust, and the asset protection you're looking for is now going to be lost. So that's a major problem we have with this trust. Now, the second problem I found in looking at this trust agreement you need to be aware of is that if somebody tells you to set up a statutory trust and create series, well, when you create the trust, it actually has to state that it is a series trust when you're creating that trust. Now, in this particular trust, we ran into that problem as well. It didn't state in the certificate of formation that this was going to be a series type trust arrangement. And by not doing that, then you don't get the benefit. So the client who set up all these separate series, they're not receiving the benefit of it being a series trust in the way in which it was set up. Now, if you're looking at this right now, you say, well, Clint, I see Series G. That is the actual beneficiary of this trust. So what they did here is the person who set it up, they set up a DST here, and then they had another DST cell or series as the beneficiary. But the trust itself fails because it is not a series trust. It was not formed as a series trust. So that's the one of the main problems we have with this. Now, another problem that you have with this type of trust when you set it up is that who you choose is your trustee. So This individual right up here was listed as a trustee. Now, if you're setting up a trust in Delaware and you want it to qualify, you have to have a Delaware trustee. And the Delaware trustee can be an individual, but they have to have a place of business in Delaware. Now, in this trust, this individual does not have a place of business in Delaware. And to make matters worse, after the trust is set up, the individual resigns their position in the trust and effectively turns over control. You can't see who these individuals are. I've blacked out their names, but it turns it over to the investors and makes them the trustees. That is not the way these trusts work. Once you've done that, you've lost the protection of this Delaware trust when the original purported Delaware trustee resigned. So here's another red flag when you're creating these types of trusts, that you cannot set them up unless you have an actual trustee in Delaware that has a physical address there and as a place of business, essentially is what they're saying inside of Delaware. So I wanted to bring this to your attention because there's a lot of individuals out there that talk about asset protection. They say, hey, here's the latest, greatest thing. And I'm not saying a Delaware Statutory Trust is not a bad idea, and it may work in certain situations. But what I'm telling you is when you're setting them up, you have to make sure you're working with someone who actually understands what they're creating and just not hearing about the latest strategy themselves and thinking this is going to be a great idea and I'm going to go market it. Because what can occur is that if you're involved in a lawsuit, you never know how good your asset protection is until your clients have been sued and you've seen them being able to walk out the other side of that lawsuit without losing their assets. In a case like this, if this client of mine now that were to be sued and they kept that original structure in place, they would not be that fortunate. And I can guarantee you an attorney would tear this trust apart and dismantle their asset protection. I've said this many times in many of my videos, asset protection is not a one-size-fits-all approach, and you have to understand the types of entities you're using and make sure you're using them appropriately in the right situations. In this situation, huge fail, trust wasn't set up right, doesn't meet the objectives the client was looking for. Hey, if you like this type of video and you want to learn more and see more of this, be sure to hit the subscribe button to my channel so whenever I produce a new content, you'll get notified of it. Look forward to seeing you at my upcoming events as well. There's a link below you can click on in the show notes where I talk about tax and asset protection at a live one-day event. It's completely free. I bring together my team of CPAs and attorneys that are there to answer your questions, and I educate you on using statutory trusts, limited liability companies, corporations for investing, for growing your business assets, and then we show you how to save tons in taxes. All right, everyone, take care.